What happens when Hollywood's most beloved daytime host meets the world's most controversial royal? You won't believe what unfolds when Meghan Markle sits down with Ellen DeGeneres for what was supposed to be a routine promotional interview. The tension in Studio 1A was palpable from the moment the cameras started rolling, and by the end of the night, social media was erupting with clips that would change everything we thought we knew about both women. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these two powerhouses clash in ways nobody saw coming. The atmosphere backstage was already charged with an unusual energy. Meghan Markle had arrived at the Warner Brothers lot in Burbank with her usual entourage, but those familiar with the show's operations noticed something different in her demeanor. Gone was the carefully crafted warmth she typically displayed during media appearances. Instead, there was a steely determination in her eyes, a woman who had clearly come prepared for battle. Ellen, meanwhile, was going through her pre-show routine, with her characteristic confidence, but even she seemed to sense that tonight would be different. The show's producers had been buzzing about potential talking points all week, particularly around Meghan's recent business ventures and her ongoing relationship with the British press. What they didn't anticipate was how quickly things would spiral once the cameras began rolling. As the familiar opening music filled the studio and Ellen made her entrance to thunderous applause, the audience had no idea they were about to witness television history in the making. Ellen's opening monologue was typical fare, but when she introduced Meghan, there was an undercurrent of something more pointed in her words. Please give a warm welcome to someone who's never been afraid to speak her truth, even when it makes people uncomfortable, Ellen said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Meghan Markle, everyone! Meghan walked onto the stage with practiced grace, but those watching closely could see the slight tension in her shoulders. The hug between the two women lasted a fraction longer than usual, and when they separated, both were wearing expressions that suggested this interview would be anything but friendly. Meghan, it's so good to have you back, Ellen began as they settled into their chairs. You look absolutely radiant, as always. Thank you, Ellen. It's good to be here, Meghan replied, her voice carrying a subtle edge that regular viewers of the show might not have caught, but Ellen certainly did. The first few minutes proceeded normally enough. Ellen asked about Meghan's children, her life in California, and her various charitable endeavors. Meghan answered with her usual poise, but there was something rehearsed about her responses, as if she was saving her energy for something bigger. Then Ellen shifted gears, leaning forward with that familiar conspiratorial expression that had become her trademark when she was about to dig deeper. Now, Meghan, I have to ask because our viewers are curious. There's been a lot of talk lately about your new business ventures, particularly your lifestyle brand. Some people are saying it's a bit opportunistic, given your royal connections. What do you say to critics who think you're capitalizing on your title? The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. The studio audience, which had been warmly receptive moments before, seemed to collectively hold its breath. Meghan's smile faltered for just a millisecond before she composed herself, but Ellen had clearly struck a nerve. I think it's interesting that you would characterize building a business around causes I've championed for years as opportunistic, Meghan replied, her voice steady but with a new coolness. I've always been passionate about empowering women and supporting ethical businesses. The fact that some people want to reduce that to royal opportunism says more about them than it does about me. Ellen's eyebrows raised slightly, a gesture that regular viewers knew meant she smelled blood in the water. But you have to admit, Meghan, the royal connection doesn't hurt. I mean, let's be honest here. Would any of these companies be partnering with you if you were just Meghan Markle from Suits? The question was delivered with Ellen's characteristic blend of humor and bite, but this time the bite was sharper than usual. Meghan's posture straightened, and for the first time since sitting down, she looked directly into Ellen's eyes with an intensity that made the host shift slightly in her chair. Ellen, I find it fascinating that you would suggest my worth is tied entirely to my marriage. I had a successful career. I was advocating for women's rights, and I was building a platform long before I met Harry. But I suppose it's easier to diminish a woman's accomplishments by suggesting she only achieved them through her relationship with a man. The temperature in the studio seemed to drop several degrees. Ellen's smile became more forced, and she glanced toward her producers off camera for just a moment. This wasn't going according to the pre-interview notes. "Oh, come on, Meghan. You know that's not what I meant," Ellen said, attempting to inject some levity back into the conversation. "I'm just saying that being a royal duchess probably opened some doors. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, we all use our connections, right?" But Meghan wasn't letting her off the hook that easily. "Actually, Ellen, I think it's exactly what you meant. And frankly, I'm disappointed. I expected better from someone who built her career on authenticity and supporting other women." The audience was now completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Ellen's famous quick wit seemed to desert her for a moment as she processed Meghan's direct challenge. "Look, I'm not trying to attack you here," Ellen said, but her tone suggested otherwise. "I'm just asking the questions that people want answered. Isn't that what good journalism is about?" Meghan let out a small laugh that held no warmth whatsoever. "Journalism? Is that what we're calling this? Because I thought I was here to discuss my humanitarian work and my new projects, not to defend my right to exist as a successful woman in my own right." The tension was becoming impossible to ignore. Camera operators were adjusting their angles to capture every micro-expression, and the show's director was frantically signaling to Ellen to steer the conversation back to safer ground. But Ellen, perhaps driven by years of unchallenged authority in her domain, pressed forward. "Meghan, I think you're being a little sensitive here. This is just a friendly conversation between two successful women. But since we're talking about success, let's talk about your relationship with the press. You've had some pretty harsh things to say about media coverage, particularly in Britain. But don't you think that criticism comes with the territory when you choose to live such a public life?" It was at this moment that anyone watching closely could see Meghan's entire demeanor shift. The carefully maintained composure cracked, and what emerged was a woman who had clearly reached her breaking point. Her eyes flashed with a combination of anger and disappointment that made Ellen actually lean back in her chair. "Choose to live a public life?" Meghan repeated, her voice rising slightly. "Ellen, are you seriously suggesting that I chose to have tabloids lie about me daily? That I chose to have my character assassinated in the press? That I chose to have my family torn apart by manufactured controversies?" The studio had become a powder keg, and everyone present could feel that something explosive was about to happen. Ellen, perhaps realizing she had pushed too far, tried to backtrack, but it was already too late. Meghan was no longer the composed duchess who had walked onto the stage 20 minutes earlier. But just as it seemed like the confrontation might reach its peak, Ellen made a decision that would prove to be her biggest mistake of the evening. Instead of de-escalating, Ellen doubled down with a smirk that would soon be replayed millions of times across social media. "Well, Meghan, you did choose to do that Oprah interview where you made some pretty serious accusations. Some might say you opened that door yourself." The words hit the studio like a thunderbolt. Meghan's face went completely still, and for a moment, the only sound was the low hum of the studio lights. Even the camera operators seemed to freeze, sensing they were capturing something that would define both women's legacies. "Excuse me." Meghan's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more menace than if she had shouted. "Are you seriously suggesting that speaking my truth about racism and mental health struggles was me opening a door to abuse?" Ellen realized immediately that she had crossed a line, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. Years of unchallenged authority had made her believe she was untouchable, that she could say anything and charm her way out of consequences. She was about to learn how wrong she was. "I'm just saying that when you make public accusations, people are going to respond. That's how the media works, isn't it?" Ellen's voice carried a defensiveness that betrayed her growing discomfort, but she pressed on. You can't expect to drop bombshells like that and then complain when people want to discuss them. The audience was now completely silent, many of them shifting uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't the light-hearted entertainment they had come for. Several audience members were already pulling out their phones, sensing that they were witnessing something historic. Meghan stood up slowly, her movement so deliberate and controlled that it commanded every eye in the studio. Ellen remained seated, perhaps thinking this would give her some psychological advantage, but instead it made her look small and defensive while Meghan appeared to tower over her with righteous fury. "Ellen, let me be very clear about something," Meghan began, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who had been pushed beyond their limit. "When I spoke about experiencing racism within the royal institution, that wasn't a bombshell or an accusation for entertainment value. That was a woman sharing her lived experience of discrimination and trauma." Ellen tried to interrupt. "Meghan, I think you're misunderstanding." "No, Ellen, you're misunderstanding," Meghan cut her off sharply. "You're sitting there, in your position of privilege, suggesting that I somehow deserved the racist abuse I received because I had the audacity to speak about it publicly. Do you hear yourself right now?" The confrontation had reached a point of no return. Ellen's face flushed as she realized that her usual tactics weren't working. She couldn't charm her way out of this, couldn't deflect with humor, couldn't rely on her audience to laugh away the tension. For the first time in years, she was facing someone who wouldn't be intimidated or manipulated. "That's not what I said, and you know it," Ellen snapped back, her own composure finally cracking. "I'm trying to have an honest conversation here, and you're turning everything into an attack. Maybe the problem isn't everyone else, Meghan. Maybe sometimes you need to look in the mirror." The words echoed through the studio like a physical blow. Several audience members audibly gasped, and one of the producers off-camera made a throat-cutting gesture, signaling to Ellen to stop. But she was too far gone to notice. Meghan's expression shifted from anger to something more dangerous. Disappointment, mixed with a cold fury that made Ellen suddenly realize she had just made a catastrophic error. "Look in the mirror?" Meghan repeated slowly as if tasting each word. "Ellen, I want you to think very carefully about what you just said. You're telling a woman who experienced racist abuse to look in the mirror when she speaks about that. Abuse. You're suggesting that I'm the problem for not quietly accepting discrimination." Ellen was now visibly panicking, sweat beginning to form on her forehead under the hot studio lights. She glanced desperately toward her producers, but they were all staring at her with expressions of horror. This wasn't just going badly. This was career-ending territory. "Meghan, please, let's just take a breath here," Ellen attempted, but her voice was shaking now. "I think we're both getting a little heated, and maybe we should—" "No, Ellen, we're not both getting heated," Meghan interrupted, her voice cutting through Ellen's attempted de-escalation like a knife. "You're getting desperate because you've shown your true colors, and I'm responding to the fact that someone I thought was an ally has just revealed themselves to be exactly like every other person who thinks women of color should stay quiet about their experiences." The studio had become a pressure cooker. Ellen's usual confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by a frantic energy as she tried to salvage what was quickly becoming the worst interview of her career. "That's not fair, Meghan. You know I've always supported diversity and inclusion on my show. I've had guests from all backgrounds." "Having diverse guests doesn't make you an ally, Ellen," Meghan shot back. "And right now, you're proving that point perfectly. You're more concerned about defending yourself than acknowledging the harm you've just caused." Ellen made one final desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. Standing up to match Meghan's height, she pointed her finger directly at her guest, a move that would later be analyzed frame by frame across social media platforms. "You know what, Meghan? I think I've been more than fair here. I've given you a platform to promote your projects. I've asked legitimate questions that any journalist would ask, and you've turned this into some kind of persecution complex. Maybe the real problem is that you can't handle any form of criticism without crying racism." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The studio fell into a silence so complete that the whir of the cameras seemed deafeningly loud. Ellen immediately realized she had just said something unforgivable, but it was too late to take it back. Meghan's face went through a series of expressions: shock, hurt, and then a cold resolve that made Ellen take an involuntary step backward. When Meghan finally spoke, her voice was steady, but everyone in the studio could hear the barely contained fury beneath the surface. "Ellen DeGeneres," Meghan said, using her full name like a weapon, "you just told a woman who experienced documented racist abuse that she has a persecution complex for speaking about racism. You just dismissed the lived experiences of countless women of color with that single, ignorant statement." Ellen opened her mouth to respond, but Meghan held up a hand that commanded absolute silence. "And you did it on television, in front of millions of people, thinking you could get away with it because you're Ellen DeGeneres and everyone loves you. Well, let me tell you something about the Ellen DeGeneres I'm seeing right now." Meghan paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the studio like a heavy blanket. Ellen stood frozen, her fingers still pointed accusingly, but now looking more like a cornered animal than the confident host who had started this interview. "The Ellen DeGeneres I'm seeing right now is someone who has become so comfortable in her position of power that she thinks she can tear down other women without consequences. You're not the champion of kindness you pretend to be. You're just another person in Hollywood who thinks being famous gives you the right to be cruel." Ellen's face had gone pale, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The audience was completely silent, many of them recording on their phones, understanding that they were witnessing the complete destruction of one of daytime television's biggest stars. "Meghan, please," Ellen whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never meant—" "Yes, you did mean it," Meghan cut her off with surgical precision. "Every word you've said tonight has been calculated to diminish me, to make me look ungrateful or difficult or attention-seeking. You came into this interview with an agenda, and when I didn't play along with your script, you showed your true character." Meghan began walking slowly around Ellen's chair, her movement predatory and controlled. Ellen turned to follow her with her eyes, but remained rooted to the spot, seemingly unable to move. "You want to know what I think happened here tonight, Ellen? I think you saw a woman who refused to be diminished by your questions, and it threatened you. I think you realized that I wasn't going to be another celebrity guest who would laugh, along with your subtle digs and veiled insults." The camera operators were frantically adjusting their positions to capture every angle of this unprecedented confrontation. The show's director had given up trying to signal Ellen to regain control. This was beyond salvaging now. "So you escalated," Meghan continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You pushed harder, you got more personal, and when I pushed back, you revealed exactly who you really are. You're someone who thinks that being on television for 20 years gives you the right to invalidate other people's experiences with racism and trauma." Ellen finally found her voice, though it came out as a croak. "I've dedicated my career to inclusion and acceptance." "Have you?" Meghan interrupted sharply. "Because what I've seen tonight is someone who uses the language of inclusion as a shield while practicing exclusion. You talk about acceptance while trying to make me accept racist abuse as the price of speaking my truth." The studio lights seemed to burn brighter, casting harsh shadows across both women's faces. Ellen looked completely defeated. Her shoulders slumped while Meghan appeared to grow more powerful with every word. "Let me tell you what real inclusion looks like, Ellen. Real inclusion means listening when women of color tell you about their experiences, instead of questioning whether those experiences are valid. Real inclusion means supporting other women when they face adversity, not suggesting they brought it on themselves." Ellen made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Meghan, I'm sorry if I upset you, That was never my intention. Maybe we can start over. Start over? Meghan's laugh was sharp and bitter. Ellen, you can't start over from telling someone they have a persecution complex for speaking about racism. You can't take back suggesting that I deserved the abuse I received. Those words are out there now, and they reveal exactly who you are when you think you have the upper hand. The audience was now openly staring, many with their mouths agape. This wasn't just a celebrity feud. This was a masterclass in accountability, and Ellen was failing spectacularly. You know what the most disappointing part of all this is? Meghan asked, moving to stand directly in front of Ellen. I actually looked up to you once. I thought you were someone who genuinely cared about lifting other people up. But tonight, you've shown me that your brand of kindness is conditional. It only applies when people stay in their lane and don't challenge you. Ellen's eyes were now watery. Whether from anger, embarrassment, or genuine remorse was impossible to tell. Meghan, please, can we just— No, Ellen, we can't just anything, Meghan said firmly. Because this isn't about having a bad day or misspeaking. This is about a pattern of behavior that I'm clearly not the first person to experience. I'm just the first person to call you out on it publicly. The confrontation had reached its climax, and everyone in the studio knew it. Meghan straightened to her full height, looking every inch the Duchess she had once been, but more importantly, looking like a woman who had found her power and refused to let anyone take it from her. I came here tonight to talk about my work, my projects, and my commitment to making the world a better place. Instead, I've been subjected to thinly veiled racism, victim-blaming, and professional bullying from someone who built her career on the motto, "Be kind to one another." Ellen opened her mouth one more time, but Meghan held up her hand with such authority that Ellen immediately fell silent. The irony, Ellen, is that you've actually done me a favor tonight. You've shown your audience, and everyone who will see this interview, exactly what women like me face when we dare to speak our truth. You've provided a perfect example of how privilege and power can corrupt even those who claim to champion equality. Meghan began walking toward the edge of the stage, her decision made. Ellen finally found the courage to speak up, her voice desperate and pleading. Meghan, please don't leave like this. We can work this out. We can have a real conversation. Meghan stopped and turned back one final time, her expression a mixture of pity and resolve. Ellen, we just had a real conversation. This is the real you, and this is the real me. The difference is, I can live with who I am. With that, Meghan Markle walked off the Ellen DeGeneres show, her heels clicking against the studio floor with the rhythm of someone who had just reclaimed their power. The audience sat in stunned silence as Ellen remained standing alone on her stage, looking smaller and more isolated than anyone had ever seen her. The cameras continued to roll for several more seconds, capturing Ellen's face as the full magnitude of what had just happened began to sink in. Her empire of kindness had crumbled in real time, brought down not by scandal or controversy, but by her own words and actions when faced with a woman who refused to be diminished. As Meghan disappeared backstage, the studio remained silent except for the sound of phones buzzing as audience members frantically shared what they had just witnessed. The Ellen DeGeneres show had just broadcast its most explosive episode ever, and everyone present knew they had witnessed the end of an era and the beginning of a reckoning that would reshape daytime television forever.